Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Jeff Selingo, author of There Is Life After College and a contributing writer to the Washington Post. I'm the moderator for today on College to Career Reimagining Higher Education for the 21st Century Workforce. So yesterday, May 1st, was Decision Day. That's the day by when high school seniors had to place deposits to secure a spot on campus this fall. And we know where the first daughter is going now. The race to get into the most selective colleges and universities makes this time of year one of high anxiety for some high school students and their families, and even for the vast majority of students and their families who don't even apply to selective colleges. Of course, this is a season that's still one of worry, but usually about paying ever increasing tuition prices. But rarely has the anxiety been focused on the other end of college. It's long been true that if students exited college with some sort of credential, they would be fine. A college degree was a signal that somebody was job ready, a signal that got stronger the more selective the institution. And today there's a lot more noise around that signal, a subject we'll be talking about today. Slide 1. So you'll see here that nearly 50% of recent college graduates are underemployed, meaning they're in jobs that don't require a bachelor's degree. And the bachelor's degree, which was once seen as a pathway to high skill, high wage jobs, is now increasingly seen as the admissions ticket for any job. As a result, it's become much more critical for how students go to college these days, the experiences they have in that crucial time in the launch to adulthood. And as a result, in my mind, we need to rethink what we mean by college, a topic we'll be discussing today, and reimagine education after high school for this 21st century economy where careers and occupations expand and contract at an alarming speed. So over the last 2 years, as I reported my new book, which came out a few weeks ago from HarperCollins called There Is Life After College, I met many of these 20-somethings trying to navigate the wide open seas that mark today's careers. Next slide, slide 3. Slide 3, actually. Thank you. To anchor my reporting, I worked with a national survey firm to conduct a poll of people in their mid-20s. And I wanted to find out what experiences they had in the previous decade that resulted in how they launched into their 20s. And from these findings, we segmented 20-somethings into one of 3 categories. They were either sprinters, wanderers, or stragglers. And an excerpt from the book on this subject appeared in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago. And what category someone ends up in is partly a result of how they spend those years after high school. And we found 3 key differentiators. Slide 4. How much debt somebody takes on. So 43% of sprinters take on less than $10,000 worth of debt. They tend to come from families who had gone to college before, and they also tend to come from more wealthier families. The average debt right now, of course, for college graduates is around $30,000. And the more debt somebody has, the less flexibility they have after college to launch into the workforce. Slide 5. The second differentiator were internships. So 79% of sprinters had internships compared to 47% of wanderers. And with many big companies hiring only from their internship pools today, this is critically important in how students launch from college. And finally, slide 6. And then the final piece of this is the credential itself. It still matters. 99% of the stragglers by their mid-20s had some credit, but no degree. That might seem unusual, but the largest chunk of those in the US with some credit and no degree are millennials, people in their 20s. So we have a lot of people going off to college. 70% of high school students go right off to college after graduation. Only 50% of them complete their degree in 4 years, and many of them never complete any credential at all. They have some credit and no degree. The pipeline from school to college that has educated generations seems to be broken. And for the next 45 minutes or so, allowing sometimes for questions, with this panel, we're going to explore why and who is responsible for fixing it, and how we fix it for a 21st century workforce. And we have a great group of panelists with us today, and there's so many of us, I want to dive right in. So I'm going to start with Senator Bennet. So Senator Bennet, the U.S. higher education system has long been the envy of the world, but today only 4 out of 10 students who attend 4-year colleges don't even graduate in 6 years. You know, why, when we know a 21st century education demands more education, are we having so much difficulty educating so many of our young people?
Well, thank you for having me on the panel. I think there are 2 sets of issues here that we've got to face as we talk today. One is the issue of whether a college degree is preparing people well and whether more efficient ways of preparing people for the workforce. The other is to recognize as a country, when it comes to kids that are born into poverty, we are doing a horrendous job of educating them all the way through and putting them in position to access college. So if you're born poor in the 21st century economy demanding something north of a high school diploma, your chances of getting a college degree are roughly between 9 and 115 and 100. That's it. And it starts early. It starts in early childhood education, which we don't provide for poor kids. It starts when you live in a neighborhood that no one here, if they could send their kid anywhere else, would send their kid to school in that neighborhood. And then we face the fact that college has become exponentially more expensive than it was even in 1990, much less in 1970. If you're in the bottom quartile of income earners in this country, the average cost of college, the cost of the average college will cost your family 85% of your net income, whereas if you're in the top 15%, it costs you only 15% of your net income in the top quartile. And so my sort of main interest here is that I've come to see our education system is largely reinforcing the income inequality that we have rather than liberating people from the circumstances they find themselves in. And I'm worried that we're going to skip ahead as a country to this very important conversation about career and technical education alternatives without understanding that the current system is actually broken and as I said, is reinforcing the inequities that we have.
Jessica, an area that you regulate, obviously, technology is largely to not blame, but is the big cause of this transition in the workforce. The technology revolution of the past couple of decades has really disrupted entire industries and occupations. I was a journalism major in college, so trust me, I really understand how it's disrupted journalism. Is our education system, in your opinion, changing fast enough to keep up with this pace of change in overall society? And where do you think it's mostly falling short, if it is falling short?
Well, thank you, Jeff. I have a perspective that comes from my job as at the Federal Communications Commission. I have a front row seat at the digital revolution. I get to see how technology is remaking and disrupting every aspect of civic and commercial life. But so often, all of that change stops at the school doors. And what strikes me in many of the schools that I visited is that they are still in the analog era. There's no reason that we should not bring in the tools of technology into all of our classrooms. After all, students today are going to emerge from school into an economy that absolutely demands they have digital fluency, digital skills. And so I think connecting all of our schools with really high-speed services is important for teaching, for better content, and preparing students for the next generation's economy.
Well, Steve Knapp, the demands on education are greater than ever. And there's so many demands, particularly on colleges and universities. It used to be that you would go to college to get a broad education, and then you would go off into the workforce and get trained for a job, or go on to professional or graduate school and get trained in a specific discipline. Now we expect both of those things to happen at the same time, kind of the broad-based education plus kind of skills training. Do you think that's possible in today's higher education system to do that, especially with students sometimes who are not prepared for college level work? I mean, is a 4-year college or university the place to give both kind of the practical arts training as well as the liberal arts training, and how can colleges do that better?
Well, first, Jeff, I want to thank you for the attention you brought to this subject in a lot of your writings over the years. And I think you put your finger on a critical issue, which is the need to balance the traditional disciplines in the liberal arts, which have been really at the forefront of the advance of knowledge over centuries now, and really account for a lot of the cultural and industrial advancement that we've enjoyed as a civilization, and to balance that with the need to be more relevant to society and to the market than universities have traditionally been. And you pointed to the traditional model in which you got an education, then you ask the question, okay, what do I do next? Right. And I think everyone now realizes that disconnection is no longer feasible, that we've got to find ways of integrating the two. So how do you do that? Well, I think the question about 4-year colleges, that's one part of the answer. I hope at some point we'll get around to some of the alternatives to college, because I'm not one of those who thinks everyone ought to go through a 4-year college experience. I think there are a lot of alternatives that should be available to people, and they should be able to go back and forth if they change their minds in the course of their careers, and we can maybe talk about that. I'll tell you how we're approaching it. Ours is a private research university. Universities like mine, private institutions only educate something like 20% of the higher education students, somewhere between 20 and 30%, let's say, but really it's a small part of the picture relative to the number of public institutions, but I'll still tell you about our experience. So our dean of the Columbia College of Arts and Sciences, Ben Vincent's come up with an approach to this issue, which we call the engaged liberal arts. And the idea is to take the traditional liberal arts majors and connect them in a variety of ways to real-world experience and applications. So that means engaging, which is called the engaged liberal arts, because we're engaged in the professional schools, which means somebody majoring in biology or English or whatever it might be is given an opportunity to work in our professional schools of business, law, medicine, and public health and so on. And also engagement in the community, and that has to do with things like internships, and we can talk more about that. I'm glad to see your numbers there, because we were ranked twice in a row, both in 2014 and 2015, as the #1 school for internships, something we have an opportunity to do because of our rather remarkable location in the heart of Washington, D.C.
And have faculty embraced this dual model?
Well, I think so. I think what we're looking at is we don't want to water down the traditional focus on these disciplines, but the way curriculums in all of our majors were traditionally designed was with an eye towards students moving on into graduate education. And so you see the majors progressing from general introductory courses to more and more specialized work with a focus on then preparing them for PhDs, because what faculty saw themselves as doing was identifying the most talented students in those fields and preparing them to be their successors and their replacements in the future. And so that's how these fields develop, these very powerful specialized abilities and capacities to advance knowledge. But what it didn't recognize was that most students aren't going to go on to PhD programs. So what do you do to make it possible for them to take what they know and to develop those soft skills that all the employers are telling us they're looking for? And those are skills in critical thinking and problem solving, in working collaboratively in teams, having some, at least fair flexibility and ability to operate within a digital environment, and things like leadership, professional ethics, the ability to manage their careers. These are all things that students can develop at the same time that they are succeeding in the majors that reflect their interests and their passions and so on. Mm-hmm. So we've pushed career services back to the very beginning of a student's undergraduate career advising, so that now starts in orientation instead of waiting for the senior year. In all these cases, the thing is that's really important is to make sure that career orientation is not an afterthought, but is integrated with what students are learning all along, not at the expense of what they're learning, right, because they are acquiring these skills. They just don't develop ways of talking about those skills, of understanding what those skills application might be. And I think we can do a much better job. So it's a question of integrating it throughout the student's mm-hmm. career as an undergraduate and preparing them for that move, not at the very end of their career, but from the beginning.
Eric, Steve mentioned this idea of four-year colleges and and I want to dive deeper into this in a minute, about whether everybody needs to go to a four-year college. But there was an op-ed in the New York Times a few weeks ago that pointed out that among the campaign rhetoric right now, we're not talking a lot about middle skills jobs. These are jobs that don't require a four-year degree, but require more than a high school diploma. As a head of a global company, are you more worried about filling the roles of upper management in terms of people with master's degrees and professional degrees, or are you more worried about kind of the line workers who make the products you need to sell in the future?
Thanks. Well, I think we're worried about both. Maybe just a couple comments and I'll get to the middle skills. I think we obviously recruit a lot of people out of four-year schools. We don't hire as many people right out of college as we used to. We hire more experienced people. And one of the things we're finding, I think some of the comments were made here, the world is changing very rapidly. Everything we do has software connected with it. Doesn't matter what job you're in at Siemens now, you're in the digital world. If you're in marketing and communications, it's moving quickly to digital. If you're in the service business, you're out there with an iPad servicing technology. If you're in engineering or IT, you're working with our software every day. We're really more of a software company than a hardware company. We can't find enough people trained in those areas coming out of college. I mean, most of the people that have degrees come to us, that you're going to spend 2 or 3 years apprenticing someone with a 4-year degree. Their expectations for their opening salary are higher. I mean, it's a very tough sell. So literally, we hire several thousand people a year in the U.S. Less than 10% of those are out of college. And that's changed a lot over the last 10 or 15 years. In terms of technical skills, the jobs we have over 86 production facilities in the U.S., so about a third of all our 55,000 employees work in a facility. The skills required in those production facilities has gone up dramatically. In our facilities, everything's run by robots, lasers, computers, and so the skills required to work in a production job today have just changed.
And are you finding enough people to fill those
No,
roles?
I mean, I think there's two issues. One is we're not finding enough. So what, one of the things we've done is we've brought the German-style apprentice program, but we're modifying it a little bit for the U.S. And what we say is there are no jobs for anyone in Siemens with just a high school diploma, but not everyone needs a 4-year degree. But you do need, these days, you do need a 2-year degree, a certificate. So we've actually developed our own curriculum in different places with community colleges, and we pay for students while they work and while they go to school. Most of these are 3-year programs, so they get a 2-year degree, they get a certificate, they get paid while they work, they have no debt, and they're guaranteed a job if they pass it. So if you think about the story out there, I think actually, a lot of people are saying free community college. It is free community college. So I know some of the candidates running are talking about free college. I mean, it is an option. And in Germany, 60% of high school graduates go this path. In the U.S., we just said 70% go to 4-year college. So I think we're a little bit out of balance. The other thing we find is...
Why is that? Do you think it's just culturally that, and in high school, folks don't push
I think
that?
we've pushed everyone into 4-year college. And I mean, we need people going to 4-year colleges, and we have the greatest university system in the world. But we also need people who, in these middle skills, and these are good middle-class jobs. The average salary for someone going through that 3-year program who has no debt and got paid while they went to work is $55,000. The average liberal arts grad in this country is $40,000 after a 4-year degree, and they have like $29,000 in debt. Now, maybe the liberal arts grad ends up ahead at some point, but most of our apprentices who are graduating in the U.S. continue on and get a 4-year degree, and we help fund that as well. So it's just a different path. You can get to the same point. It's just it's a very different path.
I mean, one of the things that I looked at your program down in North Carolina is that counselors tend to push college because they're evaluated in high schools on how many kids they send to college. Igor, you're founder and CEO of WorldQuant. You've started the world's first completely tuition-free, completely online quantitative finance master's degree program. And in recent years, we've seen online education as touted as a solution to what's often described as a talent problem. Eric was talking about talent. Is the pipeline broken in your opinion, or does it just not draw enough talented people from around the world? In other words, this talent exists, and it's hard for people to find, to be connected to education.
Well, I think part of what we saw in connection with our business, which is a quantitative business that's globally distributed with offices everywhere, is we saw that talent is distributed very uniformly throughout the world, but opportunity is not. So to bridge that gap, we created WorldQuant University, which, as you mentioned, will be and is already world's first free master's degree program in quantitative finance. And we started our program. We have about 100 students so far from 15 different countries. So the pipeline is becoming global, just like it is for all other online delivered services. The same concepts that you have in Amazon, the same concepts that you have at Google. Why should education really be that different from a Google search? You should be able to literally type, give me a PhD in math, and have it delivered to you maybe a little slower than usual, but same concept. So that's number one. Number two is efficiency is very important here, because as a number of subjects proliferates and often degrees become irrelevant even by the time they're finished, the amount of material that has to be delivered is growing exponentially. And for that to be delivered, it has to be delivered through a more efficient platform, quite different from the platform that's been in existence for the last millennia, basically.
But Steve, going back to you for a second, there's a lot of benefit to the we talked a lot about the benefits of online education, but there's huge benefits to traditional residential education. A lot of it has always been seen as the way to develop the soft skills. But as I heard, and I want to talk to the employers on the panel as well, I hear so many employers, and employers have always complained. I don't want to give them a pass. They've always complained about college graduates going back decades, but increasingly they're complaining about the soft skills, the development of the soft skills of students. In fact, we see this analysis from Burning Glass, which last year out of Boston, which scraped 20 million online job ads, and in 4 out of 5 job ads, they found the same 25 skills listed over and over again, and the top 5 were all soft skills. You know, this ability, you know, teamwork, problem solving, communication, writing, right? Over and over again, we hear that those are not being developed. So so you have this great residential model, you've had it for centuries. What's not working about it now, or do you believe it's still working and companies their expectations have just gone up?
Well, no, I think that we can say a lot about why it is that writing skills have declined in recent decades, which I believe they have. There are a lot of theories as to why that has occurred, but we all experience that. I experienced that in my own workforce as well as in our students. And I think, and by the way, when I read those job ads, they're not always very well written either.
True.
Yeah. I think part of it is.
So do you think it's unfair that do you think employers their standards have just gone through the roof in a way?
I think those are the reasons. But those are exactly the skills that a liberal arts education ought to be providing, and those are the kinds of skills.
So then why isn't it?
So I think, you know, I would argue that in many cases we are producing those skills. I'm very impressed by the students that I encounter. You know, I have students who come to my office hours all the time with an idea of a company they want to launch, and they've worked out a business plan. They've already got congressional endorsements for it. I mean, now our students may be a little unusual. Right. We tend to recruit students who really want to, you know, have an impact in the world. So they're very practically oriented. We tend to put theory and practice together. But a lot of it has to do with, I think, being very intentional about what the skills are and how we're measuring their acquisition. You know, traditionally, and still many faculty believe that the way to measure learning outcomes is through the grades they give on their papers. But of course, those grades reflect their expectations of what they've already intended to do, not necessarily an independent measure of their success. And so that's why accreditors are now, and I totally support this, pushing outcomes measures as an important way of evaluating the success of teaching. You can't just assume that because you've got a subject matter and you're presenting it in an articulate fashion and with witty lectures and so on, right, that means that the skills are being developed. That's got to be tested, and we have to be much more intentional about it, even with things like internships. I just want to make a comment on internships. It's important that students have internships, but what doesn't happen very often is those internships are then connected with what they're learning in the classroom, and that there's an exchange or any reflection on that. So what we're trying to do now, we've always had students that are very successful in getting internships. We're now trying to get them to reflect on what's happening in those internships and understand the connection between what they're learning in the classroom and what they're doing in the real world, and how they can enhance both kinds of activities through their mutual integration. And so it's all about, I think, from my perspective, integration, and not just allowing these things to happen side by side with no thought about what the relation is.
It makes me wonder why more colleges and universities don't follow the co-op model that Northeastern or Cincinnati.
Northeastern, Cincinnati are well known in co-op.
Yeah, I mean, everybody talks about Waterloo in Canada, and they've offered that.
And those have been very successful models. Right. You know, whether that would work, it probably wouldn't work in our context. You know, one of our advantages, we have so many different kinds of organizations that surround us and so many opportunities and outlets in our particular situation. But you know, one of the great strengths of our higher education system is the variety of institutions that people can avail themselves of. And I do think community colleges are part of it. I'm very excited about the kind of thing that Igor is working on. I think that opening those many pathways is really important. And I was struck today in the Chronicle of Higher Education. There was an article in which Ambassador Martin de Hinden of Switzerland was talking about their co-op program, their apprenticeship program. Right. And what was critical about that was he was pointing out the flexibility of that once students enter on one of these paths, they don't get tracked permanently. They can move back and forth. Eric said something similar about what students are able to do if they enter his apprenticeship programs. I think we want to preserve the flexibility and the multiplicity of entry points and exit points in the system. It's one of our great strengths as an institution.
But the only way we do that, and I want to go back to Senator Bennet, is funding, right? So, you know, largely the Higher Education Act defines how we think about post-secondary education in the U.S. It's up for renewal. It's been up for renewal for a while now. Yeah. You know, what if you had the chance to kind of put in place what you wanted to in the Higher Education Act? What flexibility? What do you think needs to go in there? And particularly want to focus, by the way, on debt in particular, because it seems to be a big issue for today's college graduates.
Just let me start there, and I'll come back to the beginning. There's a debate going on right now about whether people ought to be able to renegotiate their student loans. I'm all for that. But that's not the problem. The problem is the cost of college is so high as a percentage of people's income relative to where it was 20 or 30 years ago that it's crushing folks. And this is why there's not an easy answer to your question, because it's been complicit in that has been the fact that states have reduced their funding of higher education as a result, in part, of the insistence of the federal government on expansions of Medicaid and other kinds of things, which is pushed out. So you have a situation where the folks that are funding the programs and the people that are operating programs aren't necessarily the same people. And the requirements of the federal government in non-education related fields are having a huge effect on education. And essentially the result of that is we've gone in many states, certainly my state, from a system of taxpayer-funded college education to a system of student-funded college education at a great expense through a debt market that's very unforgiving. And I think we're going to need the federal government working with the state and local governments to figure out how to align a set of incentives so that we can get back to a place that's actually conscionable. The current system is unconscionable. Right. And you asked about flexibility. I believe strongly we should be creating much more flexibility. I think for Pell Grants and for student loans to be able to support the kinds of programs that Siemens is doing, kinds of other programs that I've seen in the state. I'll tell you about one in a second. But we can't do that if we don't focus on outcomes. That's what we have to do. And we've got to take money away from institutions that are not producing good outcomes for their students and showing us a return on investment. I was in a place in Denver last week or the week before called Galvanize, which is an accelerator. It's for an incubator for small companies. They teach a class in coding, and it costs $21,000. It takes 6 months to get out of there.
You can't use federal financial aid.
You cannot, which is a bill that I have with Marco Rubio, and I'm calling Big Marco Rubio, not and you can't get federal funding for it. And even though they've got a 98% outcome rate, and you go from earning this as a retail worker to earning this as a coder, you go from being a lawyer to earning this as a coder. And I asked the people, most of them were in their 20s and early 30s, I said, you guys who here in this room has debt? Everybody's hand went up. So why are you here? Because they've had to now, there is a whole industry, a cottage industry now of folks that lend to people like these people to get that education that they then pay back over 2 or 3.
Doesn't it in some ways start a little bit earlier? Because I mentioned earlier, there's all these 20-somethings with some credit and no degree.
Right.
Many of them have debt. You know, no job ad says some credit, no degree. They want a degree. Yeah. So doesn't some of this start earlier, even in K through 12 schools, in terms of thinking about career development?
Well, first of all, a lot of these people do have degrees, and one of them said, the reason I'm here is it's the only way I can pay the debt off that I got before. Yeah. You're right about K-12. I mean, you know, you were talking about math earlier. I mean, we have a system of K-12 education where we say we want to produce mathematicians and STEM folks, but, you know, in Denver Public Schools, where I was once the superintendent, we had a 90% rate of when kids got to college that they weren't prepared to do math. And I examined that and discovered that that to get a high school diploma from Denver, you only had to have 2 years of math, unless you passed the algebra exam in the 8th grade, in which case we said to our strongest adolescent mathematicians, you only have to take 1 year of math. We are going to unburden you from taking math. Today, to get out of Denver, you got to take 4 years of mathematics, and if you pass algebra in the 8th grade, you get higher level math before you leave. It's just one illustration of how poorly arranged the incentives are for getting people into the kinds of things that Siemens needs and that the country needs out of our K-12 system. And we're spending a fortune to not get the results that all of us would like to see.
I want to turn back to Jessica and Eric for a second and talk about this idea of career development. It was interesting when I was talking to students over the last couple of years for this book, and they would talk about, you know, coming into college, having to pick a major, which they see as picking a career. And then 4 years later, they start applying for jobs, and they see all these job titles that they didn't even know existed, right? And people tend to pick what's familiar to them, right? It's what their parents do, it's what their neighbors' parents do, and given the economic segregation of the country, there's sometimes people see no jobs, right? They don't see any jobs that they could potentially do. Right. How can we do, and this is a question for both of you, how can we better prepare students much younger so that for Eric, they, for example, see apprenticeships as even a pathway? How do we give them exposure, more exposure in K through 12 schools to careers, especially at a time when we're really focused on outcomes and testing and, you know, spending much more time in the classroom than outside the classroom? Let me start with Jessica and then Eric.
Well, there's this statistic that always stands out to me, and maybe it's because I'm a parent, but that for school children today, 65% of the jobs that they'll be taking in the future don't even exist yet.
Yeah.
That's mind-numbing if you think about it. So what do we prepare them for? What I'm convinced of is that we live in a world where technology is now a language, and we have to start teaching it like a language. Because wherever you go and whatever you do, connectivity and software is going to be a part of your workplace. And I think developing that facility with technology will prepare more students for more STEM careers and every kind of career, because it's a formidable feature of our economy going forward.
Eric?
Yeah, I think maybe a couple things. One is, I forget the exact number now, but in the K through 12 schools in the US, something like under 20% of the schools are teaching things like coding that the Senator mentioned, and software development and those kinds of skills, which are now important in just about every job. And so this is a problem we run into in Germany as well. I'll go back to the German model, because I've been studying a lot as we try to adapt it to the US. There are some things we need to do differently here, but they start the dual system much earlier. Prior to even 9th grade, they start exposing young people to different not just careers, but different skills that they will need to develop. If you take a look at the German model as well, there are 350 different apprentice programs. So don't just think of it as a bunch of people going to work in a manufacturing plant. If you want to be a chef, depending on what the career is your path, you can jump out into those and give those a try. We're starting much too late. I was on the Business Roundtable, the vice chair of the Work and Skills Committee, and one of the things we surveyed the BRT companies, which 240 largest companies in the U.S. The amount of money forget what the states and the federal government spends. The amount of money that companies spend on K through 12 education in this country is staggering. I mean, but
So what's it buying?
But are there any metrics?
Right.
No. I mean, this is the thing we study. So how do you measure the performance? It's also, I think, Vice President Biden a couple of years ago went through all the federal programs, 46 federal programs, and said, where are the metrics? The thing that I really like about, we probably need to get rid of the word apprentice because it just doesn't work here. It didn't work for Ben Franklin either, but if you take a look at that,
It seems to have worked for Donald Trump.
yeah. But if you take a look, the nice thing about those programs is, at the end, I have a metric, which is I got a job. I mean, you can measure the jobs. If people go through the program, they're guaranteed a job. And this is something it's one of the reasons why the unemployment rate among 18 to 26-year-olds in Germany is much lower.
Right.
I mean, if you go through the program, you complete it, you got a job. Now, not everyone completes it, and they have their problems with it too. Their problem is more and more people want to go to four-year colleges over there. They've got pressure the other way. We've got the pressure that we're lacking people in these middle skills now. But
Right, isn't the problem now, not problem, but isn't it the case in Germany where parents who went through the apprenticeship program now want their sons and daughters to go to universities in some cases?
Right.
So, Igor, you had a chance to kind of blow up the system as we know it, and you obviously went online, but you still kind of did the traditional master's credential. Did you think at all, and as you think about the future of what you're doing, one of the things I think that we need to probably talk about is the credentialing system we have now. Is it working for all the skills that we need to show to employers? Could you talk a little bit about why you decided to stay with the idea of a master's degree, and did you think about other credentials that you could be offering in the future?
Well, I think there's a number of other credentials coming out now, certificates and that sort of thing. But until such a time as the main credentials are no longer recognized and no longer considered valid and valuable, we will
So who
focus.
has to lead that charge? Is it employers who have to trust alternative credentials, or who has to lead that charge?
I think we all have to do it together. Employers have to trust the new credentials. Education has to provide the new credentials, and the whole system needs to be changed together and in concert, right? Then there's also the issues of soft skills versus hard skills that you mentioned, and we say soft skills are very hard to find, and we see that
Hard to teach too.
hard to teach. We see that in our business a lot that we get brilliant people and they're like a bull in a china shop. You have to almost restrain them to not damage the organization. But it seems that a combination of teaching hard skills through an online system, teaching soft skills through other means like internship and other forms of education would tackle things well. And furthermore, I think the critical ingredient here is that just like Moore's law is driving computing costs down, and the cost of sequencing the DNA, as Al Gore has mentioned, is coming down. The cost of education also has to be coming down because the amount of knowledge is growing exponentially, and in order to deliver this, we don't want the cost of education to be growing exponentially too.
Right, so you bring up two opposing forces. One is that the amount of knowledge is increasing, which means that you need more education, but that education costs money, right? So I want to talk a little bit about time with all of us, right? This idea that you would go off to college, graduate in 4 years and get a job is really a relic of World War II in large part, when the returning GIs had the GI Bill, somebody paid for college, they came out, an expanding economy, they got jobs, they started families, they bought houses all by the age of 25. We know that this term emerging adulthood, we know it's taking a lot longer for students to launch into careers today. Work by Tony Carnevale at Georgetown University has found that the average age of financial independence for today's college graduates is 30. That's when they reach the median wage in the US, so it's taking a lot longer for students to launch into their careers. We know from various economic studies that students are job shopping and occupation shopping a lot in their 20s because there's just so much out there, right? There's so many new jobs, so many new occupations, so much to learn. Is part of this that we need to stop rushing people through it? Now, I know we rush people through it because of the cost of it, but I was really fascinated yesterday when, now she obviously chose it probably for a very specific reason, but I was very interested yesterday when the Obamas announced that Malia Obama is going to take a year off before she goes to Harvard. Should we be encouraging people to take more time to get going in their 20s instead of less time? And this is a question for all of you. Steve,
Yeah,
I'll start with you, Steve.
Sure. I mean, again, I think what I was struck by, again, that article today in which the Swiss ambassador was talking is he was talking about the fact that this apprenticeship option starts really early on in a high school career, but that it's possible for someone to move back into a college track if they want to do that later on. And I think any kind of flexibility can get into this. Now, again, it's not a radical departure to take a year off before going to Harvard, it seems to me, from the standard model. But
I understand there's an economic piece of that too.
By the way, the whole thing, so the Harvard thing is kind of interesting because when you talk about these alternative credentials, what's interesting is sort of everyone wants someone else to get these alternative credentials, but they want their daughter or son to go to Harvard. And and by the way, it doesn't seem that there's any other way to get to the Supreme Court but to go to Harvard or Yale. So somehow we've got to break down this kind of I mean, there is sort of a winners and losers mentality in so much of our culture here. And it has to do with the sense that, apprenticeships are seen as kind of a second best option. It's the kind of an afterthought. If you don't succeed on a college track, then you move on this other track. That's one of the reasons those programs were eliminated, because they were seen as tracking in a negative direction. And what I'd like to see is many more points of entry and exit, as I was saying earlier, and I think we can be flexible. What I don't think is going to work in a case like ours is compressing a 4-year degree into a 3-year degree. That looked like a solution a few years ago. And then what you realize is, well, you're adding internships, you're adding all these other things we're talking about, and still expecting people to get through that program more rapidly than they did before. What's happening now is the opposite, which is more students are going into these 5-year combined master's and bachelor's degree programs because, in a sense, they need to get more before they go into the marketplace. If the bachelor's degree is now only an entry level, not even an entry level degree for high-paying jobs, people have to have more credentials, not fewer credentials. So I don't think we're going to see compression of the time people spend getting educated. On the contrary, we'll probably see an expansion of how much time people spend getting educated.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Not necessarily a bad thing, and I think it's probably essential, but we can have much more flexibility in how they go about it. It doesn't have to be, the 18 to 22-year-old is the only way to do this, and if you fail at that level, you're out of the system forever. And I'd like to see many more points of entry and exit.
Senator, I want to go back to something you started with earlier about the percentage of students who, depending on their socioeconomic status, have college degrees. And one of the things as I look at the demographics of this country over the next 10 or 15 years, in 300 of the 400 counties in the U.S. where there are more younger people than older people, they are under the national median income in the U.S. right? So it's only going to become more difficult, even if college tuition never went up.
Right.
It's going to become more difficult for families to pay for college. What has to change here? Is it policy where we need to put more? You talked about states. Do states have to put more money into this? Is it the federal government having to put more money into the Pell Grant, or is it institutions like George Washington University saying they have to do something about
Well,
price?
I think at a minimum, the federal programs should find a way to help incentivize universities to keep costs lower than they are keeping costs. We have not had, we not only have we not disincentivized that, we've incentivized the increase in costs.
So more of a
we're
stick.
essentially subsidizing it, and I think we should think about ways of rewarding both quality and efficiency of delivery with our federal programs. I also think there may be an opportunity here for social impact bonds to help combine different levels of government and give us an outcomes-based approach. But I'll take the other side on the time issue, because for the kids that I see, at Metro State University in Denver, Colorado, for example, where we don't fund summer Pell Grants because the federal government doesn't fund summer Pell. These are kids who desperately need to go to college during the summer while they're working to try to get out sooner rather than later, because if they can save a year, maybe it's not 3 years on 4, but it's 4 on 5 or 6, that's a meaningful savings to their family. Federal policy works in exactly the opposite way. It imagines that it really does have as its model Malia, Obama.
Right.
Instead of, the vast majority of kids that are being produced in urban school districts all across America. And I think we need to dramatically change what we do. Finally, let me say on Igor's point on credentialing, I do think that's going to become a huge part of what happens here. Okay. And we're in Colorado, the governor is working with LinkedIn to create a kind of a clearinghouse for credentials, so that if you get a credential from Walmart or you get a credential from Safeway, that shows up on your LinkedIn portfolio and it stays there for you. What that ultimately will be and what form it will take, I don't know, but it's just an illustration of where the world is changing.
Yeah, I want to do that, and then I want to get back to Eric about badges.
So price. So look, we're going to have to take cost out of these institutions because families can't afford, because of what happened after the recession, when however many $1 trillion, I've heard $13 trillion taken out of family wealth, a dramatic reduction in the median wealth of American families. It means that there are fewer full-paying families to support the families that can't. We have this high price, high aid model, which now is even the norm at public institutions, right. as the senator mentioned. They're following the private model where full-paying families are subsidizing, or in some cases international students.
And there's not enough of them to go around.
There are not enough of them. There's a shrinking number of them, in fact. And so as the cost of these labor-intensive industries continues to rise relative to the wealth of families, we're going to have to find a way. So it's not going to require legislation to bring this about. What's going to happen? It'll happen as a result of the market reality. And so
that could potentially take too long, though, wouldn't it?
Well, I think it's going to.
We've been in some instances 8 years since the recession.
You'll probably see a bunch of colleges closing because of this. In our case, we're taking a lot of cost out of our central administrative structure. We're doing that actually fairly dramatically. We've got a 5-year plan that's got something like a 25% reduction in our central administrative costs. We've got fixed tuition, meaning that students never pay more after the first year for up to 5 years before they graduate. And we've kept our annual increase at 3% or under for all the 9 years that I've been president at this institution. So we're doing a lot to kind of control that. I think the state, but again, it's our private institutions, which have these high sticker prices, are not the nub of the problem for the United States. It's public institutions, and it is because of the defunding that's happened and all the things the senator talked about. I'm much more concerned about what's happening at public institutions than I am at what's happening at private institutions like ours. We can control our destiny much more, I think, effectively, and we will be doing that. And so I think you're going to see more and more movement in that direction. What we don't yet have, though, is the productivity gain through technology that other industries have enjoyed. And I think we just have to be very aware of that. If you went to an automobile factory 100 years ago and went to today, they'd be unrecognizable. If you went to classroom 100 years ago and a classroom today, the only difference would be the blackboard is now whiteboard.
Yeah, right.
Otherwise it's pretty much the same.
Same with K-12, except the blackboard would still be a blackboard.
Would still be a blackboard. I want to go back to Eric for a second about this idea of alternative credentials and badges. I mean, do you foresee a time in the next 10 or 15 years where badges and other types of credentials could even replace degrees, or do you think the bachelor's degree, at least for the time being, is still the strongest signal that somebody is ready for the job market?
maybe just a quick story. We had a big event recently, a 2-day event, where we brought in some of our best researchers and technologists from all over the world. And we brought in quite a few academics, and we brought in a bunch of startups to talk about, what's going to change in the digital world. And we had a conversation about this topic, about certificates and badging. And one of the things that was interesting is there was a big discussion about what was the value of a digital degree versus a traditional 4-year degree and or a 2-year degree, and how did companies assess those, and how did they put value on that? And there were a couple of startups. There was 6 or 7 people on the panel, and everyone was saying, well, I'm not sure I really value the online one quite as much as the one at a traditional university. These 2-year degrees are okay. If you get a certificate in a certain thing, that can be transferable. And a couple of the startup guys just said, this is crap. This is total crap. You guys really have to stop.
Of course,
this
they
stuff.
went to traditional colleges.
Yeah, well, and
universities,
actually,
but-
one of them had a 4-year degree from an Ivy League school, and one of them jumped around 3 or 4 schools.
Right.
But they said, look, if we need to learn something at our company, we go get a course and we get it, or we go hire someone who knows that.
Right.
Or, and a lot of them said they had taken multiple courses. One of the people said they had taken 40 or 50 online courses to supplement what they were doing. But they're learning, again, they're getting this experience-based, on-the-job training,
But
developing all these skills.
you need to figure out
Right.
though, as a company, how do I assess that? How do I trust that? If somebody's
Right.
taken 50 courses, how do I know that they've learned anything in
Right.
those courses?
Well,
I
the
mean, we don't
interesting
know
thing
that
was
with
there
bachelor's
was one of the
degree either.
German ministers, I think the Minister of Commerce was there, and he said, you know what, that's what we don't have in Germany. We don't have those guys. He said, we keep everyone from Germany flies over and visits Silicon
other words,
Valley,
it's too
and they
structured.
say, how do we make Silicon Valley? And they say, that whole thing that these guys are talking about, we don't have that. It's a very structured system. They don't have the unstructured part where people are kind of creating their own careers and developing their own. And so the certificates and the badging and things, I think it's going to become a lot more popular. I mean, the mechatronics degree that we set up in Charlotte, the number of community colleges and businesses that have inquired about how to set up a mechatronics, which is basically for production workers in an advanced manufacturing facility. And can we standardize that so wherever people go, that degree or that badge is accepted by companies as something that they can hire into for advanced manufacturing. But a lot of states accept it and some states don't accept it. So it's still in flux here. Whereas in Europe, it's pretty much accepted, right?
I want to ask 2 more questions before I turn it over to the audience. So if you have a question, get ready. Igor, I want to go back to what Steve Knapp was talking about, cost of education. In some ways, in traditional higher ed, there is no relationship between cost and price. Even as sometimes cost could go down, especially with online education, the price continues to go up. For example, a great example of this is online education in traditional colleges and universities. It might cost them less to deliver it, but they actually charge just as much or more for the degree. How have you been able to try to drive the cost of what you're doing down in order to do what you're doing in terms of a free, online degree?
Well, it's partially by necessity. Our foundation that's doing this is not very large, so we had to operate on the shoestring. So when you operate on a shoestring, you by necessity drive both the cost. You drive the cost down, and as far as the price, we believe that education should be free to everybody. So our focus first is to drive the cost as much down as possible. Once we do that, we will figure out exactly how to finance it. For now, it's just us financing it, but it's not a lot. For example, to be able to deliver a program to educate 100,000 students, it cost us less than $5 million to get that done, and I think that's fairly efficient in the scheme of things.
Mm-hmm. So, just go back to for a second. I have young kids as well. I have a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old at home, and I'm always reading these studies about how 50% of jobs will disappear in the coming years because of artificial intelligence and automation. And I'm trying to figure the rise of the robots. They know how to use any device better than I do. But of course, we were talking earlier. So far they have a very passive relationship with technology. Right. They don't really understand the underlying piece of the technology. But how can we best prepare students for this very unforeseen future where careers are going to potentially disappear and new ones will grow up?
I think you're right. I think young kids have this facility with technology, but it's passive.
Right.
And it's not enough to just be a digital native.
Right.
We have to take students and move them from being digital consumers to being digital creators. And we have to move broader swaths of our student population from consuming to creating. Because if we want to diversify the STEM pipeline, and there is all sorts of data out there to prove that we should be doing that, that's a terrific way to start. And I think that starts earlier than college and career readiness. That starts in our K-12 system, and it's something we should engage in right now.
I want to open it up. We have about 5-6 minutes left, so I want to open it up for questions. Please try to ask a question as much as possible, and we'll try to move through them as quickly as possible. Yes.
So college has always been debt financed? Thanks. College has always been debt financed, but there are some people talking about the possibility of equity financing of college, and I think Purdue in particular is kind of piloting a program for engineering students whereby you would
Invest in the student.
hypothetically graduate from college debt-free, which would have lots of benefits to the graduates, but you would give up a percentage of your income. Just for people who have maybe been exposed to this and thought about that model, is that realistic, and what are the practical hurdles to pursuing a model like that for some percentage of students that would relieve the burden?
I mean, part of the problem is that it works in certain disciplines and in certain
Yeah,
jobs.
that's what I was going to say. I
Yeah.
mean, the problem is in a place like if you're in engineering, we do have an engineering program which is growing rapidly. But the problem is at a place like Purdue, you can kind of do something like that because you have a sense of what the industries are and what the equity is likely to be. But we've got students who go into countless lines of work, or going to the Peace Corps before going into law school or something like that. So it'd be very hard for us to figure out how to manage something like that. But that doesn't mean it's a bad idea for a large state institution with a lot of technical disciplines.
Other questions? Yes, right there.
Senator, you mentioned the need to incentivize universities to keep costs down. The apprenticeship model is very interesting, and I'm so glad to see Eric here. You're here at my recommendation, actually. I'm with the Milken Institute, and I configured an earlier version of this panel. But I think it's important also to look at what's going on in Germany as a leader, but so is the UK. And apprenticeships figure strongly not as an alternative option, but as a highly desirable option. So IBM UK, for example, has a very prestigious apprenticeship program, which takes from the creme de la creme. People considering Oxbridge are attracted to this program. They want high academic achievers. And I think once the US maybe considers looking at options like this and ways that industry and government could make more of these options possible. It's not perfect in the UK. There's a controversial discussion on that. But it is working. IBM UK's apprenticeship program is working. And this could pose a good sort of market-oriented way to spur universities to reduce their costs.
It could, but isn't a big piece of this cultural?
No, well, I would say, it's Steve, right, Mr.
Yeah,
President,
absolutely,
made the very important point earlier, which is these career and tech ed programs in the United States, in our history, became ways of tracking kids. And we finally got rid of them because we didn't know how to make them rigorous. If they're rigorous and they really are desirable alternatives, I'm all for them. I'm all for them. And I do think the market, with respect to competition in the market, it will not just be programs like the one at Siemens or others, apprenticeship programs. It's going to be colleges who figure out that if they can tell students, you will graduate debt-free from this college, and we have a placement rate of 85%, that young people will say, I want that deal instead of this other deal. It's going to be internet operations, like high-quality ones, that disintermediate a four-year university that's not providing outcomes. You talked earlier about well, how does Siemens know whether or not a credentialing is actually preparing somebody? How do we know that that's happening with our four-year colleges today, in the existing system? And I think it's going to happen much faster than we believe.
But Eric, how can we sell this? I interviewed this a boy in the book who actually went through the apprenticeship program in Charlotte, North Carolina. He was on his way to become an engineer at North Carolina State, and he basically went against the wishes of both his parents and his counselor, and went into the apprenticeship program instead. So cultural, you're really pushing against a very deep cultural attitude in this country that four-year colleges are the way to go. I mean, how do you sell it? How can you sell it?
Well,
Or how can we sell it, I guess?
Yeah, I think we sell it because if you take a look at Siemens, a lot of the senior executives, in fact, probably 30–40% of the most senior people globally in the company went through an apprentice program. So in Germany, they don't think of it as, oh, I'm gonna go to work in a plant, or I'm gonna go to this next.
But that's deep cultural in Germany. How do you bring that culture to
Well,
the
that
US, right?
we've used that to basically say, at a big global company like Siemens, this is a viable career track, and though people who want to keep moving on can. If you don't want to keep moving on and taking more education, you can't. But I do agree. I think we need a heavy dose of marketing around these jobs, because these jobs, or these middle skills jobs we're talking about, are a path to the middle class, and the wages are well above, especially the manufacturing jobs, well above, about $20,000 above on average than the average wage in the country.
And
so
do you
these
believe
are
that
very good jobs.
the U.S. K through 12 system is preparing students for those jobs? Because the other thing I hear is, even if they could find students to go into these apprenticeship programs, sometimes, for example, they don't have the basic math and writing skills and reading skills to even do these jobs.
No, I mean, we're not taking into the apprentice programs. We're not taking the people that are struggling to get through high school. We're taking the A and B students into the apprentice program. I mean, we, as I said, in Charlotte for the apprentice program, we had 10,000 people apply
For how many spots?
for 800 jobs.
Wow.
When we expanded to plant,
like getting into
and we
Harvard.
couldn't find anywhere near the 800.
Okay.
We had to set up this whole apprentice program and train for a year to be able to get people to be able to work. In
Is
the
that
plant.
because of the skills that they
That's
didn't have?
because of the
those basic
skills. Yeah, yeah.
In the UK, there are at least 5 websites, one I can recall, not going to uni.com, on the marketing element, which I think it makes clear that apprenticeship, the word apprenticeship has to change its meaning. It already has in the UK.
Yeah.
They also, many of them put people through college. Again, the highest academic achievers qualify.
Right.
For many
You
of
also
these
have to
programs.
change the incentive system, because counselors are largely judged
Yeah.
on the percentage of students they send to college. Actually, nobody cares what happens to them after they get
And I
there.
think there's been great
but-
leadership by Cameron too. I think he set a target for 1 million apprentices or something
Yeah,
like that.
there's
yeah.
a question up front here. Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi. In terms of retention around the apprenticeship program, I don't know if you've had enough data. Do you have a higher retention rate around people that go through the apprentice program versus a 4-year program? I'm thinking of from the point of view of a value proposition to corporates to actually put in place apprenticeship programs.
We're only several years into it here. The data so far is pretty good, but we don't have the kind of data that they have in Germany. Obviously, in places like Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and stuff, and now the UK, as they're saying, is developing a program. The data is very strong. Actually, when you take a look at the value proposition with the amount of money corporates spend anyway, again, I think this idea of people saying free community college, I think it's very doable with this model, because right now we actually pay the apprentices while they work and while they go to school. In Germany, the federal and state government pays for the actual school part. If we could get the federal government and the state to pay for that, I think you get companies to pay for people to work for them and the other. So you get the experience-based training, you get the academic training in this thing, right? And that really makes the whole thing work. And it ends up for students being, debt-free, and again, they're guaranteed a job at the end, which I think has a huge value to it. Which we were saying that's the real hook that we sell to parents and to administrators at the schools, high schools that we're recruiting at, is if you get through this program, you got a job at the end, and here's what the job looks like, and here's what it pays.
We have 3 minutes left, so I want to just go quickly, lightning round through all the panelists. What's the one thing that you want to happen in the next, especially for this next administration coming in, that you think would really help reduce the friction from education to the workforce? I'll start with you, Senator.
I think actually it's the alignment that he was just talking about. Which the hard part is getting these different actors in a place where we can do it. But we're spending so much money on this as it is. We just aren't getting the outcomes that we need. We didn't talk at all today about workforce dollars, but those dollars are spent year after year after year, and it's an accounting exercise to say we spent them properly. What we should be understanding is, or be seeing, is that we train these people, now they're being paid here instead of being paid here. I'd like to see that as a policy
So
change.
alignment.
Yeah.
Well, I'd say consistent alignment over time, because one of the problems is we have these experiments, and a government program will focus on one of them, and then administration shift. This happens locally as well as federally, and probably more often locally, where superintendents of school systems serve for a year or two and then they're thrown out and a new system comes in. We've actually had some success in all places, Washington, D.C., because we've had 3 mayors who've kept the same approach to education reform in place. So consistent alignment of K through 12, colleges and universities, and employers, all the way up and down the chain, and doing that strategically and intentionally and really focusing on it in a consistent way. I'd love to see the administration lead that.
Perfect. Jessica?
Digital skills distributed more evenly across the country so that our next generation workforce better reflects the diversity of our population.
I think really it's talked about a lot and people kind of pass it by, but getting the public-private partnership, getting companies, getting university. I mean, some university presidents like President Knapp get it. We do a lot of work with GW, but a lot of universities we approach don't want to hear, hey, we've got our courses. This is what we've been doing for X number of years. We're not going to change. That's why we work a lot more with community colleges, but also getting states, because states and the federal government. But states, the states are where the action is, because the jobs across the country, the skills required vary dramatically from state to state. I mean, Colorado has a huge aerospace business building up. The skills required for that. In DC now, the cyber and the IT is a big, the skills required are very different region by region, state by state. And so we need to get the states and the companies and the academic institutions working together. And it happens some places, but it's still patchwork.
Igor?
I'd like to see 2 things. I'd like to see more partnerships between ourselves, other universities, and industries, because we want to take our program, we want to expand it to different areas. That's number 1. Number 2, it would be really great if all these certificates were standardized. Once they were standardized, they would acquire much more value, because we're in a unique position. We see them as a university, and we see them as an employer. And as an employer, we often don't know what to make of them because there's no standard.
Thank you. I appreciate your time today. Please join me in thanking this panel. And Arizona State has a few books of my books back there, so there's only a few back there, but feel free to take one.